The first sound Judith Fairfax heard each morning was the iron clang of the kitchen door bolt. It split the silence of the dawn before the roosters even stirred. A key scraped in the lock, and the overseer's shadow fell across her like a brand. "Up," he barked, though she was already awake. She had not truly slept in years. Sleep in the slave quarters was never peace. Only brief escapes from gnawing hunger lice, and the groans of broken men and women whose bodies carried the weight of endless days. Judith pushed herself, upright on the hard dirt floor. Her dress, little more than a faded rag patched at the seams, clung damply to her skin. Her body ached, the scars on her back, thick and ropey from the whip, always stiffened in the night. Her ankle was raw where the iron cuff chafed against her skin. A chain linking her to the wall beam of the kitchen like a watchdog tethered to its post. The overseer, Bentham, yanked her up without ceremony. His breath reeked of last night's whiskey, and his whip trailed from his hand like a lazy snake. He delighted in reminding her that even in the master's fine kitchen, she was not above the field hands. She was still a slave, still owned, still punishable. Judith was dragged into the kitchen, where the hearth already glowed with embers she had banked before collapsing the night before. She set quickly to work, kneeling before the fire to blow it to life. The smoke burned her eyes and her fingers. Cracked and blistered from years of chopping and stirring, moved with muscle memory. The kitchen was her prison, but also her dominion. Everything passed through her hands: the salt, the flour, the sugar, the venison, the tobacco leaves, the imported chocolate bricks wrapped in thick brown paper. Charles Fairfax, the master, prided himself on hosting feasts that rivaled the governor's. His wealth, much of it earned through cotton and tobacco and gambling debts. Judith was the invisible architect of that show, chained in shadow, invisible to the men who devoured her creations. She remembered her mother's voice in the smoke of the hearth. Child, food keeps them blind. They see the sweet, they taste the soft, but they don't see the hands that bleed behind it. Her mother had been a cook too, till fever took her when Judith was barely 15. Judith had roasted coffee beans, kneaded bread, and salted pork for the day's meals. She worked without speaking, the only sounds the crackle of firewood, the scrape of iron pots. The heavy boots of Benton pacing behind her. Each misstep could invite pain. Too much salt in the soup, not enough rise in the bread. A crust too browned, each was an excuse for lashings. For humiliation before the others, her chains clinked as she moved from hearth to table. To the master's guests, they were hidden. No one dining in Fairfax's grand hall ever saw the blackened burns on Judith's arms where boiling grease had splattered, or the scar on her cheek from when Benton struck her with a ladle for being too slow. To them, she was just a servant, a faceless, nameless hand that fed their greed. But Judith saw them. She watched them through the kitchen doorway as they passed, the master's wife, in her silks imported from Europe, sneering at Judith's clumsy hands, the master himself, slick-haired, gold ring glinting, tossing dice on the parlor table while barking orders for more wine, and the overseers laughing as they strapped men to the whipping post outside, their cruelty ringing out like bells over the plantation fields. The kitchen chains clattered as Judith stirred the morning porridge. Her heart hammered a silent beat against her ribs, each thud a reminder that she was still alive, still enduring. She whispered to herself, so soft only the flames could hear, "Not forever." The kitchen air grew thick by noon, heavy with the scent of roasting venison and spiced gravy. Judith's arms ached from kneading dough. Her fingers, raw where salt and heat had cracked the skin. Sweat clung to her hairline, dripping down into her eyes, but she did not stop. Stopping meant punishment. She carved, stirred, basted, and plated with precision. For this evening Charles Fairfax expected guests. Cards would be dealt, bets laid, fortunes won and lost in the glow of lamplight. And while men in polished boots and fine waistcoats gambled, Judith would feed them unseen. She ladled cream into a copper pot, watching it bubble as she whisked in sugar, each crystal catching firelight before dissolving. Imported sugar, white as bone, harvested by black hands broken on Caribbean plantations. Judith knew it well. She tasted it only when she licked her fingers by accident. For the masters, sugar was luxury. For the slaves, hunger was daily law. At the far end of the kitchen, Dinah shuffled timidly, scrubbing pans too large for her thin arms. The girl was 12, with eyes too wide and hands too small for the work forced on her. Judith kept one eye on her, protective as an older sister might be. She knew what awaited Dinah if the mistress's gaze lingered too long. A slap, a pull of the ear, perhaps worse. By late afternoon, the kitchen table was filled, roasted venison glistening with fat, loaves of golden bread, pies cooling in their pans, candied pecans shining like jewels, tureens of stew fragrant with cloves and pepper. Judith placed each dish on heavy silver platters, carried out by other slaves into the master's dining hall. Through the swinging doors, Judith glimpsed it all, candlelight flickering against red velvet drapes, men laughing with cigars dangling from their lips, women in silk gowns sipping brandy. Their plates overflowed, their cups refilled before empty, and outside. In the slave quarters, Samuel gnawed on a piece of cornmeal, hard as stone. Judith knew because she had seen him that morning, his ribs pressing against his thin shirt, his eyes dulled from years of sun and lash. Children scoured the dirt for scraps tossed out with the dogs. Women shared bowls of watery broth, feeding their babies before themselves. The contrast was unbearable. Judith stirred a pot of gravy so forcefully the spoon clanged against the copper sides. Overseer Benton, leaning against the doorway, smirked. "Careful now," he drawled, tapping the whip coiled at his belt. "Master don't like his food angry. He likes it sweet. You know what happens if it ain't?" Judith lowered her eyes, forcing her voice into submission. "Yes, sir." When Benton left, she exhaled, her grip tightening on the spoon. She thought of Samuel's whispered words the night before. "One day we'll rise, Judith. One day we'll take back what they stole." He spoke with a fire she no longer dared to fan. But his hope burned in her, small and dangerous. When the feast ended, the silver trays returned, smeared with grease, the wine bottles emptied, the pie dishes scraped nearly clean. Judith and Dinah licked their fingers as they washed each plate, not for taste but for survival. Even a crumb of cake or lick of gravy was more than the quarters ever gave them. Later, when the kitchen quieted and Benton had gone, Judith tucked a crust of bread into her apron. She carried it through the shadows, past the cabins, slipping it into Samuel's rough hand. He clasped hers for a moment, his palm warm, calloused. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of thanks and grief. "Keep breathing," Samuel whispered. "Keep waiting." Judith nodded, though her heart twisted. For how long could she keep waiting? For how long could she keep waiting? The night was heavy with heat and cigar smoke. Inside Fairfax's great hall, laughter rolled like thunder. Cards slapped against oak, coins clinked, and whiskey burned the air with its sharp sweetness. Judith moved between kitchen and parlor, carrying trays of sugared cakes and glasses of brandy, her eyes down, her body careful. Charles Fairfax sat at the head of the poker table, flushed and sweating. He waved his cigar like a king's scepter, boasting of his luck. Overseer Benton hovered near, eager for scraps of approval. The other planters roared with each hand, some pounding the table. Others cursing their losses. Judith prayed the dessert would hold a souffle. Delicate and trembling, pulled from the oven with hands steady despite her racing pulse. She placed it gently on the silver tray, powdered sugar drifting like snow. If it rose high, she would be spared. If it sank, she knew what would follow. The dining room erupted when the souffle collapsed under the heat of the lamps, its center caving in like a beaten chest. Fairfax's laughter curdled. He slammed his fist against the table. "Goddamn wench can't even bake," he snarled. Benton seized Judith before she could retreat. His grip was iron, his breath sour with whiskey. He dragged her outside into the humid night where the slaves were already gathered. Summoned from their quarters to witness, the whipping post stood at the center of the yard, its wood dark with old stains. Judith's stomach turned at the sight. How many backs had bled here? How many cries had rung into the night air, swallowed by indifferent stars? Benton tied her wrists to the post. The rope cut into her skin. He uncoiled his whip slowly, savoring the moment, while the drunken masters stumbled out to watch. 20 lashes, Fairfax declared, his cigar glowing like an ember. Place your bets, gentlemen. Let's see if she screams before 10. Coins clattered into a pouch. Laughter rolled across the yard. Judith's blood turned to ice. The first lash struck like fire. Her body jolted against the ropes, the skin across her back splitting with the crack. The crowd roared. She bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. Second lash, third, fourth, each one tore deeper. Each one followed by Benton's grunt and the master's jeers. 5 lashes and not a sound, one of the gamblers crowed. Stubborn wench. By the 10th, her dress clung wet and sticky. Her vision blurred, but still, she stood, jaw clenched, refusing them her screams. Benton's arm gleamed with sweat as he raised the whip again. Somewhere in the crowd, Judith's eyes locked with Dinah's. The girl's face was pale in the moonlight, trembling, tears spilling freely. Judith forced herself to stare back, steady, unbroken, as if to say, "Look, see me." Survive this too by the 20th lash. Her body sagged against the ropes, her breath ragged. The masters clapped and laughed, satisfied by their spectacle. Fairfax tossed Benton a coin. "Good show," he slurred. "Let her remember her place." They left, stumbling back to their brandy and cards. Benton untied Judith, letting her crumple into the dirt like a rag doll. Back burning, dress torn, cheek pressed to the earth. Feel the weight of humiliation pressing heavier than the whip. And yet, in the darkness of her pain, something stirred. Not defeat, not surrender, but a vow. She whispered into the dirt, words rasping out between broken breaths. "Never again. I will not die their slave. I will make them taste what they've fed us all these years." Asterisk, days after the whipping. Judith's back still burned with every movement. The wounds oozed beneath her ragged dress, sticking the cloth to her skin. Dinah tried to help her wash in the creek at dawn, but the water stung like acid. Judith bore it in silence. Pain had become her shadow. It walked with her everywhere, yet still she cooked. She roasted pork, boiled greens, kneaded bread, and sugared cakes with trembling hands. Fairfax's appetite did not pause for her suffering. No lash, no scar, could excuse delay or imperfection. It was during one of these long, smoke-choked evenings in the kitchen that Esther appeared. Esther was older, her hair streaked gray, her back bent from years of picking cotton. She walked with a limp, her left foot twisted from an old break that had never healed. But her eyes, sharp, burning, knowing, held power. Esther came under the guise of helping shell beans. She sat near the hearth, her voice low. As Benton's boots paced outside, "You carryin' more than food in them hands, girl," she murmured. "You carryin' a power." Judith looked up, wary. "Power don't feed a body." Esther chuckled, though the sound was bitter. "There's food that heals and food that kills. The white folks think we only know to sweat in the fields, but we got knowledge older than this land. My mama taught me. Her mama taught her. There's plants that mend bones, and plants that stop a man's heart quicker than the lash." Judith froze. The air seemed to thicken with Esther's words. The crackle of the fire felt louder, the shadows deeper. Esther leaned closer. "Nightshade, oleander, hemlock. You know the look of 'em?" Judith shook her head slowly. "Then I'll show you." The next night, under cover of darkness, Esther led Judith to the edges of the fields, where wild growth tangled thick and untended. She pointed to plants by touch of hand and whisper of breath. A purple bloom that looked too pretty to be harmless. A cluster of green leaves bitter enough to sour the tongue. "This here," Esther said. "Touching the nightshade will cramp a man's belly till he begs for death. And this," she pointed to oleander, "boiled just right, will kill quicker than a knife." Judith's chest tightened. She thought of Fairfax at his poker table, laughing as Benton's whip bit into her back. She thought of Benton himself, swaggering through the yard with blood on his boots. She thought of Samuel starving, of Dinah crying, of the hollow-eyed children in the cabins. Her mind began to stir, a dangerous thought forming like yeast rising in warm dough. "What if," she whispered, her voice shaking, "what if the feast they love so much was the one that ended them?" Esther studied her, long and hard. "That's a heavy road, child. You walk it, there ain't no coming back." Judith pressed her lips together, tasting the ghost of blood where she had bitten her tongue during the whipping. Her back throbbed with each breath. "They already killed me," she said softly. "All that's left is the part of me they ain't touched yet." Esther nodded once. "Then listen close. You gotta measure careful. Too much, they'll taste it. Too little, they'll live. But just enough. Just enough will make 'em fall like wheat in harvest." In the kitchen the next day, Judith's hands moved differently. As she stirred sugar into cream, she thought of poisons ground fine as flour. As she sifted cinnamon into dough, she imagined bitter herbs hidden beneath sweetness. Cooking no longer felt like servitude. It felt like practice, like sharpening a blade no one could see. She did not know when the chance would come, but she knew this. When it did, she would be ready. When it did, she would be ready. The storm rolled in with a growl that evening, thick clouds pressing low against the horizon. The air was heavy, charged, as if the earth itself sensed what was to come. Charles Fairfax was in rare form, flushed with anticipation. He had sent riders out earlier that day, summoning his fellow planters for a night of cards and brandy. He promised them a feast to rival Richmond's finest, and it would be Judith's hands that created it. In the kitchen, fire blazed hot. Sweat slid down Judith's temples as she beat eggs into froth, folded flour into batter, and melted chocolate over simmering water. Dinah scurried at her side, scrubbing pans, fetching spoons, her wide eyes darting every time. Benton's boots echoed near the doorway. Judith's back still bore the scars of her last punishment, the fresh wounds stiff beneath her dress. Each time she bent to the oven, pain tore through her body, but her face betrayed nothing. Her hands moved with careful rhythm, steady as if she had done this 1,000 times. In truth, she had only tonight. She measured more than sugar and spice. Inside a small wooden bowl, hidden from Dinah's sight, lay the powder Esther had given her. Oleander leaves, dried and ground until they resembled nutmeg. Bitter enough to choke, but invisible when folded into chocolate and cream. Judith had pounded it herself by lantern light, whispering prayers with each strike of the pell as she stirred. Samuel's words haunted her. "One day we'll rise. Tonight." Judith thought the rising would not come with guns or fire. It would come with sweetness, with the very dishes her masters craved. She paused, staring into the dark swirl of chocolate. Her hands trembled for the first time. If discovered, she would hang. Worse, Dinah or Samuel could suffer in her place. Was vengeance worth the cost? Her back pulsed with the memory of the whip. Her stomach twisted with the memory of children gnawing on scraps while Fairfax's guests gorged themselves. Her mother's voice whispered in the smoke. Food can blind them, or it can open their eyes. Judith exhaled slowly and tipped the powder into the bowl. She stirred until it dissolved, till no trace remained but a bitter secret hidden in velvet sweetness. By nightfall the great hall glowed with candlelight. The poker table stretched long beneath chandeliers, cards stacked high, brandy poured deep. 8 men gathered Fairfax at the head, with 7 fellow planters, men as cruel and arrogant as he. They joked about wagers, about slaves bought and lost, about women traded like horses. Their laughter was thick, their words dripping with greed. Judith entered silently. Placing platters along the table, roasted duck glazed in honey, spiced pecans, sugared cakes, chocolate tarts glistening under the flicker of candles. She did not look them in the eyes. She bowed her head, her heart pounding so hard she feared they would hear it above their laughter. As she withdrew, Dinah tugged lightly at her sleeve, whispering, "Miss Judith, can I taste one?" Judith's blood froze. She crouched quickly, gripping the girl's shoulders. Her voice was urgent but gentle. "No, child. Not tonight. Not ever. Promise me." Dinah's eyes widened, confused, but she nodded. Judith pressed a crust of bread into her hand, forcing a smile. "Here, eat this instead." From the doorway, Judith watched as the men devoured her feast. They laughed, drank, shoved sweets into their mouths with fat, jeweled fingers. Fairfax boasted of his luck, waving a cigar in one hand while cramming a chocolate tart into the other. No one noticed Judith's steady gaze. No one saw how her lips trembled as she whispered, too soft for anyone to hear, "Eat, taste it all. Taste what you've made of us." The storm outside broke, thunder rattling the windows as rain slashed against the glass. Inside, the poker game raged on. The men, too drunk with power and greed to sense the trap closing around them, Judith stood in the shadows, waiting at first. Nothing seemed different. The men kept dealing cards, their voices loud, their laughter rolling like thunder against the storm outside. Fairfax boasted about his winnings, his face red from whiskey, sweat shining on his temples. Benton stood watch near the door, arms folded, smirking at Judith whenever her eyes flickered his way. Judith lingered in the shadows of the hall, wiping her hands on her apron, her body trembling with a tension she could barely contain. Then it began. A cough from one of the planters, a choking sound buried in laughter. Another man frowned, pressing a hand to his stomach. Fairfax sneered at them until his own hand shook as he tried to lay down a card. His cigar slipped from his lips, tumbling into the pile of chips. The laughter faded into silence. Chairs scraped against the floor. One man doubled over, groaning. Another clutched at his throat, gasping as though the air itself had turned against him. Fairfax cursed, his voice breaking as he staggered to his feet. His face had gone pale, sweat dripping in rivulets. He opened his mouth to speak, but only foam spilled from his lips. His eyes bulged wide, wild, as his knees buckled. He crashed onto the table, scattering cards and coins across the floor. The others followed. Groans turned to screams, then to gurgles. Some vomited, their bodies convulsing as they toppled from their chairs. Plates shattered as men thrashed against the table, knocking over trays of candied pecans. Spilling brandy into the firelight, the storm outside roared louder, rain hammering the windows as if the heavens themselves bore witness. Benton lunged forward, shouting, "What's happening?" He grabbed Fairfax by the shoulders, shaking him, but the master's body had already gone limp. Benton turned, eyes wide with panic, and then he, too, doubled over. His whip slipped from his fingers as he fell to his knees, gagging, his breath cut short. Judith stood frozen in the doorway. Her heart pounded in her ears, her breath sharp and shallow. She had dreamed of this moment in whispers, in pain, in blood-soaked nights, but the reality was a storm of chaos, louder, heavier, more terrible than she had ever imagined. Dinah clutched her apron, eyes wide, trembling like a bird about to break its wings. Judith knelt quickly, pulling the girl close. "Don't watch," she whispered. Though her own eyes did not waver from the scene. "Don't you ever forget what they did to us, but don't watch them now." The great hall, once filled with laughter and arrogance, descended into an eerie silence. The only sounds were the storm outside, the crackle of the fire, and the final choking gasps of the men who had ruled over hundreds of lives with fists, whips, and chains. One by one, the bodies stilled. The storm's fury passed as quickly as it had come. Rain softened against the roof. The fire in the hearth hissed as spilled brandy seeped into the logs. Cards and coins lay scattered on the floor like worthless scraps. Judith straightened slowly, her body trembling, her face pale, but her eyes burning with something fierce. Not joy, not relief, but a grim resolve. "Mama," she whispered into the smoke-filled air. "I made them taste it." The kitchen felt heavier that night as she returned, Dinah silent at her side. The other slaves had been driven to their quarters, ordered not to leave. The hall reeked of sickness and death. Judith sat alone before the dying embers of the hearth, her apron still damp from Dinah's clutch, her hands trembling as she rubbed them together. She knew what had been done could not be undone. She had crossed the line between survival and defiance, and she knew, too, that the world outside those plantation gates would come for her. But for this one night there was silence. No laughter. No whip. No master's voice cutting through the air. Only silence. And in that silence, Judith felt something she had not tasted in all her years of chains. A sliver of freedom. A sliver of freedom. The silence did not last. By dawn, word had spread like wildfire. 8 men, masters of wealth and land, found dead in Fairfax's hall after a night of feasting and cards. Their families howled, overseers whispered, and the white townsfolk of Virginia clutched their throats in fear. Poison, they muttered. The slaves have turned. The plantation gates were locked. Dogs prowled the grounds. Soldiers and slave catchers rode in, muskets slung across their backs. The air smelled of iron and smoke, as if war itself had come to Fairfax's land. Judith was dragged from the kitchen before the morning meal. Benton had survived longer than most, long enough to croak her name before death dragged him under. That was enough. She was bound in chains. Wrists rubbed raw as the overseers jeered. They beat her before the other slaves, a warning written in flesh. Strips of skin burned from her back as the lash sang. Yet Judith did not scream. Each crack of the whip echoed, but her lips held firm, her eyes locked on the horizon. If they wanted her tears, they would starve. The others watched in silence. Dinah wept into her hands. Old Isaac, too broken by years of labor, bowed his head. No one dared move. To show sympathy was to invite the same fate. Judith's cell was a tool shed, dark and damp, rats gnawing at the corners. She was given no water, no food. Days bled into nights, the chains biting deeper into her flesh. Still, she remembered. Her mother's lullabies, the scent of cornbread baking in her childhood cabin, her father's voice telling her to stand straight, no matter the weight. She clung to those fragments of humanity as her body withered. But the planters wanted more than her body's suffering. They wanted spectacle. They wanted to reclaim power, to show every slave in Virginia that the price of defiance was blood. So they prepared a gathering. Masters and mistresses from across the county were summoned. The gallows was built not for hanging, but for humiliation. Judith was hauled out, barefoot and bleeding, her dress in tatters. Chains rattled as they forced her onto the stage. The white crowd jeered. Some spat. Children laughed at the sight of her torn skin, her broken body. The overseers grinned, waiting for the command. A preacher raised his voice, declaring her a devil. A Jezebel, who had murdered God's chosen with witchcraft in her cooking. He called her a warning from heaven, that slaves must never rise above their station. Judith listened, her body swaying with weakness, her lips cracked with thirst. Yet her eyes burned with fire. When they demanded she begged for mercy, she raised her chin instead. "You call it poison," she rasped, her voice hoarse but steady. "I call it justice." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A whip lashed across her face for the words, but Judith did not falter. In that moment, though her body was broken, her spirit stood unbroken before them all. And the other slaves, watching from the edges of the crowd, felt it. That flicker of defiance, that proof that chains could bind the body but not the soul. The masters could torture her. They could kill her. But they could not silence her truth. And so, as the sun burned down on her battered frame, Judith's fate was sealed. The retribution had begun. Asterisk, the stage was set for death. Judith's body, frail yet unbowed, stood before the gathered masters of Virginia. Her wrists were swollen from chains, her back a map of scars, her dress stiff with dried blood. Yet when the overseer lifted her head by the hair, the fire in her eyes did not waver. The sentence was already written. She would be executed. But it was not enough for them to simply kill her. They wanted her broken, erased, her story swallowed by fear. So they planned to burn her alive, a spectacle of flame to scorch the will of every slave who dared to dream of freedom as the pyre was built. Judith closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mother singing soft hymns by candlelight, her father's rough hands steadying her when she stumbled, the taste of sweet molasses on stolen bread. The past wrapped around her like a cloak, keeping her steady as the crowd screamed for fire. Dinah stood among the slaves at the edge, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest, the one Judith had mended for her with scraps of thread. Old Isaac's face was carved in stone, his jaw tight, eyes unblinking as he bore witness. The torch touched the wood. Flames licked the air. Heat swelled, smoke choking the sky. Judith did not cry out. Her body shuddered with the agony of burning flesh, but her voice rose above the crackle of fire. She sang a broken hymn, the same lullaby her mother once whispered to her in the slave quarters. The sound pierced through the jeers of the crowd. For the slaves listening, it was not a song of death, but of memory, a call to never forget. Tell them. She gasped through the smoke, her voice ragged but clear enough for those closest to hear. Tell them we tasted freedom, even if only in fire. Her body crumpled at last, swallowed by the flames, but her defiance lingered in the heavy silence that followed. The masters returned to their plantations, smug in their vengeance, but unease curled in their bellies. They had killed Judith, but her act had burned something into the soil itself, a whisper of rebellion they could never fully silence. Among the slaves, her name became a secret prayer. Mothers whispered it to their children at night. Men sang it under their breath as they bent in the fields. And Dinah, holding that ragged doll, swore she would carry Judith's fire in her heart until the chains broke for good. Years later, when freedom finally came, Judith's story still lived. They called her the woman who cooked justice, the slave who fed poison to her masters and paid with her life. Her recipes were never written down, but her courage became a recipe of its own, one of memory, defiance, and the bittersweet taste of resistance. The masters thought they had destroyed her, but Judith remained not in body, but in the hearts of those who remembered, and memory, stronger than chains, sharper than whips, lived on.